Okay, welcome back. So I've gotten a lot of comments on previous videos I've made about stories and specifically D&D, but games in general, and also, you know, why I don't know, people just have strong opinions about it, and so do I. That's why I'm making these videos. I have some thoughts, okay? Now, I'm not really trying to, as I've said before, tear down your game. If you're just improvising stories in D&D, great. Just keep doing it. It doesn't really matter. We're not here to tear apart at each other. There's too much of that in the world. We don't need it in our gaming. But I think that there are some ways to improve your experience with characters and playing pretend in games, specifically D&D, but I'm going to broaden this more to all games. And I'm going to start. So I've got a little thesis here, but I'm going to start by telling you a story about a game I played with my son the other day, and I think it's got some lessons in it that we can use for D&D and other games. So we're playing a game. I'm going to let you guess what game this was first. But in this game, I became a character. And in this character, I was a doctor who lived on a houseboat. I owned a houseboat, but I also owned a farm with a pool in the backyard. And I drove around in a sports car with a pink panther in the back and a tropical parrot. Just a parrot. I had a parrot and a panther in the back seat of my car driving around, and I had this midlife crisis. This character was so engaging for me and came alive so much that I had to tell you about it. And I played this game again in which I was a character who was an engineer. I made some significant investments in a startup in this game and made a ton of money. And I won the game based on the decisions I made and this character that I was playing. And this game is called The Game of Life. You might be familiar with it. I believe it's by Milton Bradley. It was one of the most fun games I played when I was a kid, and I was delighted to see my child discover it all on his own at the same age and fall in love with it in the same way I did, because it's so engaging. It's so engaging. The Game of Life. If you're not familiar, you spin the spinner, you move around a board, there are event cards, you make money, and it's a simple board game for children, but it's got a lot of, I wouldn't call them narratives per se, but you can make them narratives. So you can, you have this character who rides around in a car, and you're just a little peg who gets put in a plastic car, and you have a career and a family, perhaps. Unexpected events happen in your life. And everyone has a very similar path, but it can take different tracks. And I think D&D is a lot like the Game of Life in some ways, anyway. And I kind of want to talk about that, just how the mindset you have playing the game improves the gaming so much. Because I think I'm going to call it from here on out the inference mindset, when you infer events out of the details of a story. And I'm going to contrast these a bit with what I will call, these are all my terms. I just wrote this, but I think that there are a few mindsets that you can take into gaming. One is the inference mindset, and I'll describe what this is. The other is a procedural mindset, and the third is an improvisational mindset. There's probably more, but I'm just going to talk about those three. Now, when most people play the Game of Life, or a lot of games, they have what I would call the procedural mindset. They're very focused on the rules and reducing risks, mechanical execution of the game. And you just kind of, if you're playing the Game of Life, this board game, and you're just not into it. You're just kind of doing the procedural mindset version of the game of life where all right, it's my turn. All right, I've waited. We've gone around the table. I've waited for my turn to come up. I spin the spinner. I generate my random number, and then some events might happen. I might get a pet. I've landed on a space that tells me what to do, and I just execute that faithfully. And I'm just trying to optimize for the most amount of money at the end. All right, we're clear. That's how you play. That's fun. You can play a game like that. You can play D&D like that. The other mindset is the improvisational mindset. You see this a lot in D&D where people are trying to make up stories and actions on the fly. And I've argued in other videos that this mindset is not the best way to play D&D. And that's kind of too much to the ire of a lot of people who have argued with me about this. And that's fine. I mean, this is definitely an argument to be had. It's an opinion. I'm stating it. Please push back on me if you think I'm wrong. I'm not trying to pick fights. I do have an opinion here, and I want to hear what you have to say about it. But this improvisational mindset, the improv mindset, if you see it in like a board game, you see this in board games a lot when you play with little kids. They treat the game more as a toy where I can just do anything I want with no rules. We're just making stuff up. And it could be really, really fun with little children. But as they grow up and as you kind of mature, you want to play with a set of rules. Those rules add structure and clarity and a constraint that actually makes things more fun. So typically you move from the improv mindset to the procedural mindset. But I would argue there's a third mindset that your cosmic brain can access that will make the game of life more fun, board games more fun, D&D more fun, all RPGs, and that's the inference mindset. And this is where you construct meaning from the fixed game elements to create emergent narratives. So I'm trying to articulate really what I was discussing before, where so you start with an improv mindset, you make up these stories on the fly, and it's too loosey-goosey, and it can feel unmoored or arbitrary, and, it's not very satisfying if not done well. And so typically you move then to the procedural mindset where, you focus on the rules. Now, the healthy balance, I would argue, between those two is this inference mindset where you're still constructing meaning. You're making up things. You're inventing things. That's the fun part. But it's from fixed game elements. And for a lot of you, this isn't going to be anything new. You're going to be thinking like, well, of course, duh. But some of you may not realize this. So let's just talk about it a little bit. So why does the inference mindset make games feel alive? It's because fixed elements in the games, like random events that come from the game itself, and the detailed descriptions, they provide a sense of permanence, unlike improvisation, which can feel fluid and subject to change. So, for example, like when you're playing AD&D, there's a lot of tables you can roll on, or any D&D really, but like you're playing D&D, there's something real about rolling dice, consulting a chart, and now that element is injected into your world, and that feels real. And riffing off of that is where a lot of the fun is. And so when you're in this kind of inference mindset, observations become key elements in the game. And there's a lot of kind of reasoning in inference, deductive reasoning. You might be familiar with these. Inductive reasoning, abductive reasoning, where you're seeking, in abductive reasoning, for example, you're seeking the simplest, most plausible explanations from a set of observations. And I'm telling you, this is addictively fun. when you're playing a game, whether it's the game of life, a simple children's board game, or grown-up D&D, or something else. If you can pull this off, it's hella fun. For example, the game of life, there are all these random events, career paths, life changes, and if you just treat it a little bit seriously, like, okay, you got a pet. It's not just like you procedurally get, okay, I've got a pet, and that's going to grant me some mechanical bonus at the end of the game because I'm going to count up all the pegs in my car. That's cool, and that's one way to play. But imagine if that pet takes on a life of its own, and you're allowed to invent anything you want about that pet within the confines of the rules. You're not allowed to go outside the rules. You're not allowed to break the rules. But you can have a lot of fun just working within the rules, inferring from all these disparate elements that have come together through gameplay into this character. This, for example, I told you I was playing this like kind of like freewheeling bachelor who was driving around with parrots and stuff. And like, I'm not even telling you all the cool stuff that happened in the game. It was just, the game came alive because we were granting some credibility to what was happening in the game instead of just like, okay, that happened on my turn, I get a mechanical benefit. Because, well, in D&D, for example, if you have this inference-driven storytelling where it's more like you're unearthing world truths instead of just inventing them, it kind of counteracts the potential staleness of purely improv or purely procedural. And you've seen procedural play in D&D all the time where someone's super unengaged in the game and they don't know what to do. They've never played D&D before, maybe, And so it's the same thing as the game of life. You're just like, oh, you're going around playing a game and it's your turn after 20 minutes. I mean, I've complained about this before, but and then you get a random number and you kind of say what you're going to do with that random number, and then it's the next person's turn. And your D&D game is no different than a child's board game at that point. You absolutely need to be inferring details about the world from the given elements. So what is the role of detail in enabling this kind of inference? Well, you've got to balance the detail, for one. So if you have too much fine-grained detail, everyone's going to be overwhelmed. So, you may have seen this where you're generating a dungeon or something, or it depends on, whatever rule set you're using, whatever edition. And, I mean, you can get down to rolling up, like, random dungeon dressing. And that's there when you need it. But if you do too much of it, it just makes the world feel cluttered and in turn kind of lifeless when you do it that way. But on the flip side of that, too little detail leaves the players with just these broad abstractions that lack any kind of interpretive depth. So you've got to find the right balance. So to do that, you need to use your observations as scaffolding for the inference. And these games, they need to provide just enough evocative detail to ignite the player's imaginations. For example, my wife and I used to play a lot of Arkham Horror. This is a board game, sort of like the game of life with cosmic horror. And there was just enough detail. I come back to board games because board games are fertile ground for this kind of gameplay where they give you a structure and you can play in that world quite a bit. So we used to play it kind of a legacy style or RPG style, where when the game was over, it wasn't just a one-off board game, but we'd keep our characters, we'd keep anything we found, any items. But then we'd also try and like infer stories by what happened. So, once we had to go, one of the characters had to go see a priest. And, this in a procedural mindset, we got some kind of mechanical benefit, and inferring the larger story out of it, all of these things sprung forth about how this priest was selling for favors or whatever, what priests do sometimes. Sorry, this is not anti-priest or anything like that. It's in the game. This was a crooked priest. We determined. And we could determine that because we got enough game elements from the cards that we pulled, etc. And that interpretive space was open enough that we could make those stories, but confined enough where it wasn't just spiraling out of control like anything goes. To do this, you can take some steps. I mean, I don't suggest taking steps in the game. Like, you want to just make this like very natural. And again, for a lot of you, this is going to be a no-brainer, and you're going to be saying, yeah, we do this anyway. That's what makes the games fun. Great, you've discovered this. But I've played with enough people where it's like they feel it's a little cheesy to go a little further than normal with the game. So like if you're playing a board game, if you get into it too much, some people kind of like roll their eyes at you. And I don't advocate for pretending it's real or anything like that, but making it come alive through this inference is just going to often makes the game more enjoyable. And then if you can transfer that to like D&D, which you're kind of doing anyway, you're expected to do because it's a role-playing game. If you can take this mindset and amp it up even more, and then you don't have to worry about the DM writing a story. And this is kind of what I mean by why this is the biggest pushback I've gotten on some of the videos that I made about why I don't think DMs should tell stories, because it just sets everything up for failure often. Sometimes it doesn't. Well, often it does. But I think if the DM is there as a fair referee who is injecting just enough game elements into the world through randomness, random tables, etc., and let the players, in conjunction with the DM is a player who can also participate in this type of gameplay, I think you're going to have a lot of fun with it. Try it out. So to do this, you just need to observe all the game data. And this is kind of, I believe they call this the inference ladder. I've seen this around, and this is for, problem solving, not gameplay. So I'm just kind of adapting it here. If you observe all the game data, like locations, items, events, things that get randomly generated, things that are injected naturally, and then you select significant details out of that, you focus on what stands out or seems meaningful. And then you sort of paraphrase the observations, you interpret them in a way that begins to assign meaning, and then categorize what's happening. You fit these observations into a broader narrative pattern, and then you explain and evaluate all of that. You connect those observations into plausible explanations, and then act based on those inferences. You use the story that you've constructed to guide the gameplay, and then just iterate on that as new data appears. Adjust the story with new information. This is how emergent storytelling in RPGs happens. And a lot of people are offended when you say it doesn't work as well when one person is tasked with coming up with the entire story and everyone reacts to it. And then you're kind of improvising based on one person's ideas. I'm going to say that's okay. That's fine. It's it's a valid way for a lot of people to play. They're having a good time, whatever. I'm not trying to pick fights. I am trying to explore ideas in D&D and gaming and how we can have just a bunch more fun. So try those steps. I don't know. Like, for example, you can interpret. So, okay, the DM or somebody rolls on a chart and they found a ruined blacksmith shop. So, like, what do you do with that? Well, you take the observed data and you start selecting significant details from it. And maybe the DM has to make up a little bit, and that can be the back and forth, like improv aspects. But you have to work with what you're given. Again, some of you might not be clicking for some people because it just is so either like foreign to you or so natural to you that it's like, why are you talking about this? This is just how you play games. And some people might like, this is too out there, or not even out there, but just like, I'm not going to invest this much in playing a game. How do we compare these games through a lens of inference? That's kind of what I'm trying to say here. Memoir 44, The Game of Life, or Arkham Horror, D&D, or whatever. So, with The Game of Life, it kind of demonstrates how even minimal, highly structured randomness can support storytelling. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that The Game of Life that I played I created a more engaging and rich character than some D&D games I've played, just through this kind of mindset. And so in narrative-rich games like Arkham Horror, it's got enough detail for deep inference without overwhelming the player. So Arkham Horror, I would say, borders on RPG. And you can think of it as an RPG. It's got enough there. And then for like much more open-ended games like true RPGs or D&D, it still benefits from inference when the DM seeds the world with fixed interpretable events. Again, like random tables or preset events or clues that come out of like dice rolls rather than relying solely on improv. And so how does it transform the gameplay? Well, it's ultimately about discovery over creation. And that's going to seem very foreign and bad to a lot of people because creation is what you kind of want to go for. But inference feels like you're uncovering these pre-existing truths and giving the game world coherence and autonomy. And that, I would argue, makes the game more alive than just making things up on the spot and expecting your other players that you're playing with to just riff with you off of that, because often people don't want to. People don't want to riff on your idea sometimes, because if you're just making things up and anybody can just make things up, well, then they may not like your idea. But if it's coming through random game elements, and D&D does this a lot, and it's more fixed to the world, and you just can't argue about it. Like if you rolled up a ruined blacksmith shop on the D&D chart, well, that's real now. You can't argue with it. Or if the DM, in a conventional, traditional game, I mean, the DM tells you there's a ruined blacksmith shop, and let's say that comes out of a story that they wrote. They wrote up this like module themselves, and in it, the village has a ruined blacksmith shop. It's still coming from their mind, and so you're exploring the mind of another person, but through inference, you have a collective storytelling apparatus in place where you're all play acting based on elements that you've seen together at the table. So this collaboration through reasoning, all the players work together to interpret game elements. And I would argue that fosters a deeper engagement and a shared storytelling. It increases immersion and makes everything feel more alive, because the inference mindset, it bridges the structure and the creativity, and it turns games into these dynamic living worlds. The inference mindset, it engages gameplay by transforming these systems into meaningful emergent narratives.